Did you know that Britain once prepared to go to war with the United States long after American independence was already secured? Not a small skirmish. Not a diplomatic argument. A real war plan. Troops were mobilized. Warships were placed on alert. And for a brief moment, the world stood on the edge of a conflict that almost no one remembers today. That's the strange part. When people think about Britain and America, they usually jump straight to World War I or World War II. Allies. Partners. Fighting on the same side. But history is rarely that clean. Before they ever stood shoulder to shoulder, these two nations spent decades watching each other with suspicion, restraint, and quiet hostility. No peace treaty ever declared them friends. No grand ceremony marked the end of their rivalry. And yet, somehow, war between them slowly became unthinkable. So here's the real question this video will answer. When did Britain and America stop seeing each other as enemies, and why did fighting suddenly stop making sense? This story is not about love or shared values. It's about power, fear, money, and calculation. It's about moments where one wrong decision could have changed history completely. And it's about how rivalry doesn't always end with peace. Sometimes, it ends with silence. You're watching the true archive, where hidden history is explained clearly, without myths or shortcuts. If you care about real stories that shaped the modern world, take a second to like this video and subscribe. It helps this channel grow and lets more people discover these forgotten turning points. And here's a promise. If you stay with me until the end of this video, you'll see why Britain and America didn't become allies because they trusted each other. They became allies because the world made rivalry too dangerous, too expensive, and finally, too irrational to continue. Now, to understand how that happened, we have to go back to the moment when independence was already won, but peace was anything but secure. When the fighting finally stopped and the War of 1812 came to an end, there was no sense of relief between Britain and the United States. There were no celebrations of peace. No speeches about reconciliation. What followed was something far more uncomfortable. Silence. Both sides walked away from the war without a clear victory. Britain had failed to break American independence. The United States had failed to challenge British dominance at sea. The cost had been high, the outcome unclear, and the political damage real on both sides. What remained was not forgiveness, but exhaustion. American leaders looked across the Atlantic and saw a power that still controlled global trade routes. British warships still ruled the oceans. British influence still surrounded America's borders through Canada and the Caribbean. Independence had been secured on paper, but vulnerability remained a fact of life. In Washington, there was a quiet belief that another clash with Britain was not just possible, but likely. The question was not if, but when. In London, the view was different, but no less cautious. The former colony was growing fast. Its population was expanding. Its economy was taking shape. But it was not yet a strategic equal. Another war across the Atlantic promised little reward and enormous cost. Britain's priority was not revenge. It was survival as a global empire. Fighting the United States again would drain resources better used elsewhere. So the two countries did something unusual. They stepped back without settling anything. There was no trust between them. Suspicion lingered in every diplomatic exchange. Each government assumed the other would act in its own interest the moment restraint failed. But both sides also understood something critical. Another war would likely end the same way as the last one. Expensive. Inconclusive. Politically damaging. This created a fragile balance. Peace did not exist because wounds had healed. It existed because conflict offered no clear benefit. Diplomacy functioned not because of goodwill, but because disruption carried serious risk. It was a cold peace. Careful. calculated, and temporary. Because beneath that restraint, both nations were already testing how far the other was willing to go. Even as political suspicion lingered, something far more powerful than diplomacy was quietly shaping the relationship between Britain and the United States. Money. By the early 19th century, American farms, forests, and mines were feeding British industry. Raw cotton, timber, and grain crossed the Atlantic in massive quantities. British factories turned those materials into finished goods, while British banks and shipping networks kept American commerce moving. On paper, the two nations were rivals. In reality, their economies were becoming deeply entangled. This dependence created a strange contradiction. Politicians could speak harshly. Newspapers could stir resentment. But behind closed doors, decision-makers understood the risk. A war would not just destroy ships and cities. It would shatter supply chains, bankrupt merchants, and destabilize both economies at the same time. For Britain, this calculation was especially clear. The empire thrived on global trade, not continental wars. Cutting ties with a fast-growing American market made no sense. Maintaining influence through commerce was cheaper and safer than enforcing it through cannons. For the United States, the situation was just as uncomfortable. British shipping, insurance, and credit still underpinned much of American trade. A confrontation might feel patriotic, but it would expose how fragile the young nation's economy still was. So restraint became policy, even when neither side admitted it publicly. Peace was no longer just a diplomatic choice. It was an economic necessity. Disruption carried consequences that extended far beyond national pride. Every aggressive move risked hurting the very systems that kept both nations functioning. This did not erase suspicion. It contained it. And that containment mattered, because it allowed something dangerous to happen next. The United States began to test whether Britain's restraint was permanent or conditional. In 1823, the United States made a statement that sounded bold, confident, and decisive. On paper, it looked like a warning to the world. In reality, it was something closer to a test. American leaders announced that the Western Hemisphere was closed to further European colonization. Any new imperial expansion, they said, would be treated as a hostile act. It was a sweeping declaration of authority over an entire half of the globe. And yet, there was a problem hiding beneath the words. The United States did not have the naval power to enforce it. At the time, the world's oceans were still dominated by Britain. British fleets protected trade routes, controlled choke points, and projected power wherever the empire needed it. If Britain had chosen to challenge this declaration directly, the United States had little ability to stop it. London understood this immediately. British policymakers saw the imbalance clearly. The declaration did not threaten Britain's strength. Paradoxically, enforcing it would depend on British naval dominance itself. Without British ships discouraging other European powers, the statement meant very little. And yet, Britain did not challenge it. Not because it feared American retaliation, but because resisting it offered no reward. British interests in Latin America were commercial, not territorial. Trade mattered more than flags. Reopening colonial competition in the region would be costly and unnecessary. Stability served British merchants better than confrontation ever could. So Britain chose calculation over pride. It stepped back quietly. In Washington, the reaction was very different. The absence of British opposition was seen as validation. American leaders believed they had drawn a line and watched a global power respect it. Confidence grew faster than capability. In London, the doctrine was treated as useful rhetoric. Conditional. Convenient. Britain had not conceded authority. It had postponed a decision. This quiet misunderstanding mattered. One side believed restraint meant recognition. The other believed it meant patience. And between those two interpretations, tension continued to build. The real test would come not through grand speeches, but through smaller disputes that exposed where American power was real, and where it was still aspirational. The gap between American ambition and American capability became clearer in the years that followed. The bold declaration had been made, but now it had to survive contact with reality. The first test came far from American shores. In the early 1830s, Britain reasserted control over a remote group of islands in the South Atlantic. The United States objected. Diplomatic protests were issued. Principles were cited. But nothing else happened. The distance was enormous. The strategic value was limited. And the American Navy was in no position to challenge British power over a dispute so far removed from its core interests. The declaration remained intact in theory, but absent in practice. Less than a decade later, the calculation changed. In the Pacific, a chain of islands began to carry growing importance for American trade and long-term strategy. American merchants, missionaries, and naval planners all recognized the same truth. Control of these islands would shape influence across the ocean. When Britain showed interest, the response from Washington was firmer this time. A warning was issued. Not symbolic. Not abstract. Focused and direct. And Britain stepped back. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. American interest in the region was concentrated, credible, and likely to intensify. Challenging it would risk a conflict that offered little strategic gain. These two moments revealed the truth behind the declaration. It was not an absolute rule. It was selective. Where American interests were distant or weak, enforcement vanished. Where they were vital and growing, pressure worked. Power, not principle, determined the outcome. Both sides learned from this. American leaders understood that influence had to be demonstrated, not announced. Britain recognized that the United States was no longer a former colony to be managed casually. It was becoming a regional power whose reactions demanded attention. What mattered most was not who won these disputes, but what didn't happen. Neither escalated into violence. Each side chose restraint, even when irritation was real. A habit was forming. Disputes were absorbed, not ignited. Managed, not magnified. That habit would soon face its most dangerous test yet. By the middle of the 19th century, the fragile balance between Britain and the United States faced a crisis neither side could control. A war inside America threatened to pull Britain into a conflict that could undo decades of restraint. When the American Civil War began in 1861, it was officially an internal struggle. But its effects were global. Britain had abolished slavery years earlier and publicly opposed the institution. On the surface, sympathy leaned toward the Union. But morality was only part of the equation. British industry depended heavily on Southern cotton. As Union blockades tightened, mills across northern England slowed or shut down entirely. Unemployment rose. Food prices increased. Public unrest became a real concern. For many in Britain, the war was no longer a distant moral issue. It was a direct threat to domestic stability. Inside the British government, debates grew tense. Some argued that recognizing the Confederacy could restore trade and protect the economy. Others warned that doing so would almost certainly lead to war with the United States. The memory of the War of 1812 still lingered, but the situation was far more dangerous now. America was larger, richer, and far more industrialized than it had been decades earlier. Every option carried risk. Then came the moment that nearly shattered restraint altogether. An American warship stopped a British mail vessel at sea and seized 2 Confederate diplomats. News of the incident spread quickly across Britain. The reaction was immediate and severe. Troops were dispatched to Canada. Warships were placed on alert. In London, military plans were reviewed for the first time in generations with the United States, not a European rival, as the potential enemy. For a brief moment, war seemed inevitable. The crisis ended only because Washington stepped back. The diplomats were released. An apology followed. Britain accepted the concession, but the message was clear. Restraint had almost failed. The margin for error was shrinking. When the Civil War finally ended, the cannons fell silent. But the danger between Britain and the United States did not disappear. It changed form. Because the next battle would not be fought with armies or fleets, but with claims, money, and memory. The end of the American Civil War did not bring closure to the tension between Britain and the United States. It simply moved the conflict into a quieter, more dangerous arena. During the war, the Union Navy had spent years chasing Confederate raiders across the world's oceans. Many of those ships were not built in the American South. They were constructed in British shipyards, launched under the cover of neutrality, and released into global waters. The most infamous of them destroyed dozens of American vessels and disrupted trade on a massive scale. To American officials, this was not a technical oversight. It was a failure of restraint. When the war ended, Washington did not let the issue fade. The United States demanded compensation for the damage caused by British-built raiders. The claim was framed carefully. Not as revenge. Not as punishment. But as accountability. Britain resisted at first. Accepting responsibility risked setting a dangerous precedent. If neutrality violations carried financial penalties, future wars could become legally expensive in ways no empire wanted to accept. But refusal carried its own risk. Relations were fragile, and memories of how close the two nations had come to war only a few years earlier were still fresh. The dispute could have reignited hostility. Instead, something unprecedented happened. Both sides agreed to submit the conflict to international arbitration. The decision itself was historic. It signaled a willingness to settle a major grievance through law rather than force. When the ruling came, it shocked observers across the world. Britain agreed to pay a massive sum in damages to the United States, the largest international compensation payment of its time. The money mattered. But the message mattered more. Britain had chosen accountability over confrontation. The United States had proven that pressure could succeed without war. A dispute that once might have ended in violence instead reinforced a new pattern. Grievances would be absorbed, not escalated. Suspicion remained. Trust was still limited. But the idea that conflict between Britain and the United States should lead to war was quietly losing credibility. As this old rivalry cooled, Britain's attention was being pulled elsewhere. New challenges were emerging closer to home, and they would reshape how Britain viewed its former enemy in the decades ahead. By the late 19th century, something fundamental had changed. Britain's greatest concern was no longer the United States. It was the growing strain of managing a global empire in a world that was becoming more competitive every year. British forces were stretched thin across vast territories. From India to Africa to the Mediterranean, new crises demanded attention and resources. At the same time, emerging industrial powers were beginning to test Britain's dominance. Maintaining control everywhere was no longer realistic. In this shifting landscape, the United States benefited quietly. While Britain focused on holding its empire together, America concentrated on industrial growth and consolidating power across its own continent. Railroads expanded. Factories multiplied. Wealth accumulated. And all of it happened without British interference. This change was subtle but important. London no longer viewed Washington as a problem that needed managing. There was no urgency. No pressure to contain American growth. Compared to threats closer to home, rivalry across the Atlantic felt distant and increasingly unnecessary. The absence of conflict began to feel normal. But that calm was tested in the mid-1890s, when a small and seemingly insignificant border dispute in South America suddenly became a major diplomatic crisis. What happened next would reveal just how much the relationship had changed. In 1895, a border dispute between Britain and Venezuela flared into an international crisis. On the surface, the land in question was remote and economically minor. Under different circumstances, Britain might have dismissed the issue entirely. But this time, the response was different. The United States stepped in and invoked its long-standing declaration about European influence in the Western Hemisphere. Washington demanded arbitration and framed the dispute as a challenge to American authority in the region. The message was clear. This was no longer just about a distant border. It was about who set the rules. Britain had the power to refuse. Its navy remained strong. Its empire was vast. Yet London chose restraint. The calculation was simple. The territory was not worth a confrontation with a rapidly rising industrial power. Britain's strategic focus lay elsewhere, and opening a new dispute across the Atlantic offered no advantage. Accepting arbitration preserved stability at a moment when Britain could least afford distraction. The arbitration process ultimately favored Britain on many of the technical points. But that outcome missed the larger significance of the moment. By agreeing to American mediation, Britain had done something unprecedented. It had implicitly acknowledged American leadership in the Western Hemisphere. What had once depended on British convenience now rested on American credibility. This decision marked a psychological turning point. Britain no longer treated American influence as temporary or symbolic. It treated it as a reality that had to be managed. For the United States, the episode proved something equally important. Authority could be asserted without war. As the century drew to a close, the two nations were no longer drifting apart. They were adjusting to a new balance, one shaped less by rivalry and more by shared interest in stability. The next transformation would come not through diplomacy, but through ships, strategy, and an unspoken realignment of power across the world's oceans. As the 20th century approached, Britain faced a hard truth. It could no longer defend every corner of its empire with equal strength. Industrialization had created new competitors, and none concerned British planners more than a rapidly rising power in Europe. A modern navy was taking shape across the North Sea, forcing Britain to rethink how and where its fleets were deployed. This shift changed everything. British strategy began to focus closer to home. The most powerful ships were pulled back toward European waters, where the real threat was growing. But withdrawing forces from distant regions carried risk. Those spaces could not simply be left unguarded. That is where the United States entered the picture. Without any formal agreement, an unspoken understanding began to take shape. As British naval presence in the Caribbean and parts of the Atlantic quietly declined, American naval power expanded into the space that was left behind. The change was gradual, almost invisible on the surface, but strategically decisive. On maps, it looked simple. British fleets moving east. American fleets filling the western Atlantic. This realignment worked because it served both sides. Britain accepted that American dominance in the Western Hemisphere was inevitable and, if cooperative, useful. The United States framed its growing naval power as stabilizing rather than threatening, careful not to challenge British interests elsewhere. There were no ceremonies. No treaties. No public declarations of partnership. But something remarkable had happened. For the first time, Britain and the United States were no longer planning against each other. Their strategies now assumed restraint on the other side. The idea of war between them was quietly fading from military thinking. What replaced rivalry was not friendship, but predictability. And as Europe moved closer to a catastrophic conflict, that predictability would prove decisive. When war erupted in Europe in 1914, Britain and the United States faced the same global crisis from very different positions. Britain entered the conflict immediately, bound by treaties and by a long-held strategy to prevent any single power from dominating the continent. The United States chose neutrality, reflecting public opinion and a deep tradition of staying out of European wars. On paper, the two nations were not aligned. In practice, they were already moving closer. American factories, farms, and shipyards began supplying Britain and its allies at an enormous scale. Food, weapons, raw materials, and industrial goods flowed across the Atlantic. British ships carried those supplies through dangerous waters, while American banks extended credit that kept Britain's economy functioning under the strain of total war. Neutrality existed in name, but economics and logistics told a different story. Each month, the connection deepened. This growing dependence created tension. Germany understood that cutting Britain off from American support could change the war's outcome. Submarine warfare expanded. Neutral ships were targeted. American cargo was destroyed. American lives were lost. Every incident pushed neutrality closer to collapse. What mattered most was not a single event, but accumulation. Each sinking blurred the line between neutral and belligerent. Each loss made it harder to argue that staying out of the war protected American interests. Then came a final shock. Germany announced unrestricted submarine warfare and secretly attempted to draw another nation into conflict with the United States. The message was unmistakable. A German victory would reshape the world in ways that directly threatened American power and security. At that moment, neutrality stopped making sense. In 1917, the United States entered the war. Not as Britain's former rival, but as its essential partner. The decision was framed in moral language, but it rested on strategic reality. Britain's survival and America's future were now inseparable. When American forces arrived in Europe, they confirmed what decades of restraint had already proven. War between Britain and the United States was no longer imaginable. Under the pressure of global conflict, alignment became structural. And once that structure was in place, it could not be undone when the fighting ended. When the First World War ended, there was no sudden declaration that Britain and the United States were now friends. In fact, many old tensions resurfaced almost immediately. The United States pulled back from European political commitments. It rejected permanent alliances and insisted that wartime debts be repaid in full. Resentment grew on both sides of the Atlantic. But something crucial was missing. Before the war, every disagreement carried the possibility of escalation. After 1918, that expectation was gone. Too much had changed. Too much had been proven under pressure. War between Britain and the United States no longer appeared as a realistic option. It felt unnecessary, impractical, and dangerously irrational. During the conflict, cooperation had become routine. British and American navies had coordinated across the Atlantic. Financial systems had intertwined to sustain the war effort. Military planning had aligned around shared objectives. These habits did not disappear with peace. They reshaped how both governments understood power and survival in a far more unstable world. For Britain, the lesson was clear. American power was not just influential. It was decisive. Britain could no longer preserve its global position without accounting for American interests. For the United States, the war revealed something equally important. Britain's survival directly affected American security. A hostile Europe dominated by a single power was no longer tolerable. The rivalry that once defined their relationship did not end through reconciliation. It ended because it no longer served either side. Economic interdependence, strategic alignment, and shared experience removed the incentives for hostility. What remained was not sentiment, but structure. The foundations of cooperation were now stronger than the reasons for conflict. By the early 20th century, the question of when Britain and America stopped seeing each other as enemies had already answered itself. Not in a single moment. Not by agreement, but through decades of decisions that made war unnecessary, impractical, and finally unthinkable. So when did Britain and America stop being enemies? Not when a treaty was signed. Not when leaders shook hands. And not when history books decided to call them allies. They stopped being enemies when fighting each other stopped offering any advantage. Over decades, rivalry was slowly drained of its purpose. War became too costly. Conflict became too unpredictable. And the world grew too dangerous for old grudges to survive. What replaced hostility was not friendship, but realism. Two nations learned, again and again, that restraint achieved more than force ever could. This is the part of history that often goes unnoticed. The absence of war rarely makes headlines. But it is the quiet decisions, the moments where escalation is avoided, that shape the future most deeply. Britain and America did not choose peace because they trusted each other. They chose it because the world made rivalry obsolete. And that may be the most important lesson of all. If you found this story insightful, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think rivalries ever truly end, or do they just change form? Let me know in the comments. And if you believe this kind of hidden history deserves more attention, share this video with someone who enjoys understanding how the world really works. It helps the True Archive reach more people who value depth over noise. Thanks for watching.